This podcast is brought to you by PLI, the Practicing Law Institute. PLI is committed to keeping you ever current on topics that matter to you, like artificial intelligence. Learn more at pli.edu/AIPod.
Welcome to AI in Data Law, part of the PLI Evercurrent podcast. I'm William Tanenbaum, host of the podcast and head of AI and data practice at Moses & Singer in New York. In this series, we bring you the latest perspectives on AI and data through timely talks with thought leaders working at the intersection of AI, data, and the law. In this episode, my guest is Karen Silverman, the CEO of the Cantellus Group, and our topic is Generative AI and Corporate Governance. Welcome, everyone. Very pleased to have as our guest Karen Silverman. Karen was a partner at Latham Watkins for 20 years and is now the CEO and was the founder of Cantellus Group, which does provide AI and governance and other kinds of services to large corporations and also works with those in the emerging tech and startup world. So I thought, Karen, I'd ask you to tell our audience a little bit about your career trajectory from a law firm to Cantellus and why you formed it and what need you perceived to be in the business world.
Well, thank you for having me. Looking forward to this conversation. So yes, coming off of a sort of decades-long career in big law at Latham and the Department of Justice and some other firms before that, I've always been in the business of working with companies or the organizations, sometimes public organizations, sort of in these sort of strategic moments, whether they were mergers or product launches or government investigations. And partly by virtue of my areas of interest and partly by virtue of where I sit, which is in the Bay Area, technology has sort of been a part of that always. I think I just sort of concluded, not many, 4 years ago or so, that there's a whole category of issue that has a legal element to it, but is really a set of business problems that intersect with those legal problems around emerging technologies and how they are used and what kinds of opportunities and risks and challenges they are going to present. So I really sort of just took that insight and, about what my clients were really dealing with and importantly, kind of not dealing with, because there wasn't anybody to help them deal with it. And we built Cantellus to do that work, to really support boards, C-level executives, and anybody who's responsible for running an organization that is trying to incorporate these technologies that do new things, right? And change a lot of our assumptions. And in the last year or so, that's become a more overwhelming sort of problem set for a lot more organizations because of the kind of proliferation of the tools and generative AI. But the problem's been around for a while, and adapting to that and having a platform and the team around me to adapt to that from a business problem perspective has been really interesting.
Yeah, it's been fun. I think both of us have been through a number of disruptive technologies, which 5 years down the road seem to have been pretty much mainstream. So the question, I think, is whether AI is fundamentally different or another type of disruptive tech. Personally, I think it does have characteristics that do make it fundamentally different, at least as far as being incorporated in the day-to-day operations of a business, as opposed to becoming part of the infrastructure that supports it. New use cases, new capabilities. Yeah. But with that observation as background, I'd like to kind of go back to what you focus on, which is advising the board of directors and the C-suite at these companies as they're adopting AI. Both, let's call it predictive AI and generative AI, machine learning and analytic AI, the old-fashioned kind of non-generative AI, and today's generative AI. So how did the board see AI compared to other generations of technological evolution?
So how do they and how should they, or maybe still slightly different questions?
Well, that was going to be my second question.
Yeah.
We'll go with that. We'll go with either one.
I think right now there's a lot of curiosity. There's a lot of overwhelm. There's a little bit of denial going on, right? About how, and then part of it is that, those of us in this area, and if you just read sort of what's out there about artificial intelligence and its likely impact, everybody's saying is, everything's going to change, things are going to be different, but it's very hard to fill in those blanks and say how it's going to change or why it's going to be different or, what to do about it, right? So there's a little bit of a stymieing loop that we're in. All that said, I think that level of metabolism is not really addressing the core issue. And boards are, I think, intrigued by the possibilities to improve impact, redirect their businesses. They are starting to sense the new kinds of risk management they're going to have to do. They're anticipating that there will be new kinds of compliance issues that they're going to have to deal with, but they haven't really grappled with, I think, the really predicate sets of issues, which is the organizational readiness. Like, are they ready to take advantage of the opportunities, manage the risks, do the compliance? And so there's a lot of present work and question asking that could be done and should be done at a board level that isn't, it can sound sort of operational, but it isn't. But, really making sure that the organization is prepared to execute on these new strategies and these new processes. And that's a question of resources and priority setting and budget reallocating and all the kinds of things that boards do, right? So how can, emotionally, where are they? Topically, almost every major board at this point has put this issue on an agenda. Have they put it on a regular agenda? At the right cadence, we can have that conversation. Are they doing the things that really need to be doing? I'm not sure most boards are still focused in the right place on this.
What are the ones that are successful doing, given that we're at this, the stage you mentioned where it's pre-strategy is the way I'm hearing this.
Yeah. And it's, so the ones who are doing this really well, I think, are looking at this set of issues as a digital suite of issues, right? So it's not just AI in the corner over there. What might it do? It's how does AI, data protection, cybersecurity, national security, how do all these issues start to impact what we do as an organization, what our risks are, now, midterm, long-term, and what can we be doing today to improve our odds in each of those categories? And they're exercising a lot of curiosity and a lot of discretion. I think the companies that are not diving in deeply, who are sort of say, well, we're not really using it yet, so we're not going to think about it yet. I think that's where boards are, I've seen a few of them get off track. And it's mostly because they're busy with other pressing problems, right? But how do you reallocate your time as a board to make sure that you're asking the deeper questions and resourcing yourself as a board and your management as a team to answer the deeper questions?
Now, I know you're CEO of a company, but what resources do boards use to develop the strategies?
Some of those resources exist in their organizations, but maybe not where they're used to looking for them.
Where are they hiding?
Some of those resources are hiding in your consumer insights department.
Interesting.
These guys have been using predictive analytics for decades to understand, and predict human behavior and sort of what good looks like and where predictive analytics can go off track. And they understand the data science about as well as anyone does, right?
Okay.
So that's one place you can look. I think that the reflex to, so that's one area. I think, interestingly, a lot of the resources coming out of the sustainability offices, right? These are teams that are used to looking at societal impact, from one dimension or another. Clearly, the legal teams and as I say, the almost every organization I know went first to a sort of data protection or IP lawyer and said, "You're now our AI officer," or whatever it is, and that's sort of not a complete solution or fair to that person. So I think looking for resources that are diverse, right? So they've got multi-stakeholder in the terms of domain expertise and in terms of lived experience. I think on the outside, looking for resources who can help boards separate the signal from the noise. There's a lot of noise out there, and what's noise to you might not be noise to me, but somebody who understands your business well enough, who can go out in the world to understand what's happening, both from a trends perspective, but also from a technology perspective, who can help cut through the hype and start ordering these problems in a sensible way with you. And so those resources are going to be trusted advisors wherever, in a variety of different corners of the earth. And it's one of the things we try to do is bring together, the intuition when I was sort of creating the group that I've got now was to draw on not just lawyers, but true professionals and experts from a whole variety of high stakes, complex industry backgrounds, academic backgrounds. And each organization is going to need to do some version of that. So.
Yeah, I just want to take a sidetrack for a moment because I do think there is a connection between AI, data governance, and sustainability. The connection I see is a lot of companies are running data centers using a lot of energy for that, a lot of power energy and the make it happen kind of electricity sense. I think a lot of companies buy data museums when they do acquisitions, and they get a lot of personal information that they're storing and is more of a liability than a benefit because it's sitting there unused until it turns into a fine when you get a breach. So Why should you have it in the first place? But to go back to sustainability, it seems to me that companies are looking at their data, looking at the servers they're using, and using AI to go through and figure out which data do we need, which data do we not need, which servers do we not need, how can we turn off those servers, improve our sustainability posture, both for corporate relations and just for operational purposes.
And just risk management.
And risk management as well with respect to sanctions. So I don't know if there's a lot that you want to speak to about that, but I just wanted to point out that I do see the connection between sustainability and AI as a tool to be more sustainable.
I think that is definitely one point of connection. And I would say that data governance, both from the sustainability perspective, but also just from the good hygiene perspective, is part of that organizational readiness that I'm talking about. Every organization right now should have resources dedicated. And by that, I mean budget and time and they're kind of most skilled leaders focused on, do we have our people ready? Do we have our data ready? And do we have our process ready? Right. And that is work that we can start doing now. Right. And data is a huge part of that because what we're already starting to see already is that, the executives have sort of stars in their eyes about what these tools can do for them and how this stuff can work and improve all these sort of either generating efficiencies or creating new lines of business. And then they go look to see if the data is in order to do that. And it's not, either it doesn't exist or it's a mess or they don't have consents for it or it's incomplete or whatever. And these are all issues we can be working on while the tools are getting developed.
So does that mean that the data organizations within a company constitute, an internal resource?
100%. Well, the data organization, the security organization, and the and the legal sort of data protection organizations all have to. That's what I'm saying. This is a digital suite set of concerns and considerations. And as soon as you're talking about data protection and cybersecurity and AI, you're also talking increasingly about national security and kind of understanding and rethinking sort of categories of risk and operations around the world. And so we work with global companies very often or global organizations. And so it would be uncommon for us only to be solving for a US set of problems that was unaffected by other global developments, influences, standards, whatever that is.
So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the national security aspect of a global company's operation. Is this because they provide critical infrastructure or because, I'll just stop there. What is the connection?
Obviously, depends on the business, but as I say, it's, national security is not just for petroleum companies anymore, right?
Right, yeah.
And part of it's because of where, product comes from, data comes from, technology comes from. Part of it is where all that stuff is going, right? We've got a world in which, sanctions regimes and other national security priorities are starting to influence where and how we do business. The ability to govern and control where data go, how we, like on the financial institutions in particular, sort of the know your customer kinds of levels of understanding and controls. All of that, I think, is becoming sort of a bigger part of how successful and robust businesses are running. I also just think from a cybersecurity perspective, there are both state and non-state threats that are now AI enabled, right? That are creating both on the just sort of incursion side and on the information side, new kinds of risks and threats that need to be defended against. And part of the way to defend against those is to cooperate. And cooperate is a strong word, but to engage more with, for instance, the U.S. government and the cybersecurity teams that the U.S. government has stood up to support U.S. industry. Like those engagements are becoming more and more important, and they're becoming more and more not just about security, but also about the use of artificial intelligence on both sides of the security risk. So I don't know if that helps, but it's the role and relationships of business to government when it comes to understanding these threats and meeting these threats is increasing. And certainly from the generation you and I grew up in, which is, you really didn't, unless you were in a regulated industry, you didn't deal with sort of government resources unless there was a problem or until you had to. That is no longer really I think going forward, that won't be the right model. There'll be a much more regular engagement on just day-to-day operations to keep them up.
Yeah, I've had clients where, the general counsel calls me to say that the FBI just told them that they were, the subject of a state actor. The FBI knew it, the company didn't. And
exactly. And we have rules against companies collaborating in certain ways that you sort of need you need the government to see the pattern.
Right.
Be able to kind of distribute that information, but then the government also needs information from companies in order to complete those pictures or to enhance those pictures. That's not information that traditionally companies are comfortable sharing. Yeah, I mean, so we just have to we're going to re-engineer some of these relationships, and I think it's not a passing fad. I think it's kind of the new normal, at least for the next midterm.
Yeah, that's a very interesting development. So, does the new executive order figure into that, or do we have to wait for the agencies to do their things? Or I guess another way, is this part of the mandate is to?
Yeah, and I think, I actually think national security issues were very central to getting that EO out the way it came out when it came out, right? I mean, it was also sort of hustled out to correspond with a lot of the AI safety stuff that was going on globally. But I think the national security concerns and risks really kind of lit a fire under what was an interesting and sort of unfolding conversation within the government about how to regulate AI or whatever words we were using. I think the national security stuff created some urgency around that we see reflected in the EO in a couple of different ways, both in its length, its breadth, and the calendar that it imposed on sister agencies.
So for the national security angle, with boards are seeing this, I suppose, not really as a risk, but as a new dimension to business operations. What resources they're using to put themselves in a position to achieve that kind of integration, both with the government and integrating national security in the strategic plans and the governance. So It's always fun to ask 4 questions at once. So pick which one you'd like to answer.
Well, I mean, I think auspicious would be a strong word, but I think it's probably useful that these issues are becoming obvious at this time while they're looking in general for how to resource board work going forward or how to support management teams going forward, right? So part of that suite of insights that you're going to need to develop on a regular cadence, like none of this is one and done. And that's the other mind shift we all need to just kind of make, which is that there's several mind shifts, but one of them is that this is an ongoing practice, right? That we can set up systems that work well, but those systems have to be tended and adapted. And as you're setting up resources for a board or from C-suite or just corporate leadership, you should look for resources that understand the geopolitical context and sort of the puts and takes, not just of how regulation gets developed and interoperability of standards and things like that, but also just from just kind of a raw geopolitical risks perspective. What sorts of adaptations, either on their own security side or on the kind of, on the national security side, will they be expected to make? And those are all, they're not answerable. Like I said, there's no one answer to that question, but there are resources out there that can and should be tapped and integrated into board thinking about risk and strategy.
So this probably does differentiate AI then from other technological disruptive events, technology that more closely implicates what you've just identified, the national security risk and the need for greater cooperation.
Well, and you look at, just taking China for a second. I mean, there's lots of conversation around sort of China's approach, not just to the technology development, but to the uses, right, to which they're going to put the technology and how that is going to both enhance their competitiveness and also, societally, what that will implicate. And it's not just that businesses have choices to make about like where they manufacture their products and where they, where data reside and things like that. It's that there will be 3 or 4 very different geopolitical sort of approaches to these technologies. And commercial organizations are going to need to understand what those options are and how they relate to those alternatives and options and what demands are going to be placed on them and what, opportunities are going to open up on account of that. Right. But all of that becomes part of the conversation. And it's hard, which is a hard conversation to have in the abstract. But increasingly, these questions are relevant to more and more commercial operations.
So what I'm hearing is that companies now have to think about how, companies in China and the government itself are going to leverage AI for their own policy goals.
What's going to be possible, what's not going to be possible.
Yes, aside from really sophisticated surveillance tech, which is a different societal issue. And on the other side of this, I mean, just looking at the AI regulations, to give you my perspective, a touchstone of all those regulations is risk, and the magnitude of the risk for certain applications. So I presume now boards have to decide how to structure their businesses in light of their risks. And I know when you and I have spoken, it was, it's a little too early in the day to have compliance when you haven't, you don't have operations that are really meant to, to address
and
compliance.
Compliance is going to rotate, as you say, around risk and kind of the minimum standards for a particular activity, right? They're not going to answer the question about how should we be using this technology to advance our future or protect against, competitive threats or whatever it is, right? So there's a whole category of inquiry that precedes, I think, the compliance question or runs parallel to the compliance question. They intersect on what will be possible and allowable, but strategy is a different set of questions. And then understanding how risk management might differ from risk mitigation when you're talking about AI, right? That there are different kinds of trade-offs just because of the way the technology works that mean that the way we usually think about risk, we have to kind of upgrade and update, right, for more dynamicism, more velocity, more cadence, that kind of thing.
So let's narrow the focus a little bit down to just a board, a company, a suite of technologies.
Yeah.
Okay. And put aside some of the more emerging compliance problems and the national security problems for a second. So what are the steps? And I know this is kind of going back over some of the ground, but I think there is some utility to put a sharp point on it for the purpose of this podcast. Okay. You have a company. They know they need to have a strategy. What are the steps to getting to the strategy?
So first thing is to get the team together, like to develop, if you're talking from the perspective of a CEO or a chairman, like where do you want me to dial it in?
CEO first.
Okay. Think originally about the team you want assembled and in the room to advise on these issues and to go out and do the inquiries you're going to need to do. So it is not enough just to call your CIO and say, get me some of that AI stuff. Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then call your general counsel and say, and make sure we don't screw it up. A lot of what's going on is that's not the right approach, right? So you need to assemble a team that can really sort of do 2 things. One, focus on, 3 things probably. what is happening today? What can we be doing today? What is likely to be happening, and how should we be preparing for, midterm, and then third, if you're really enlightened, you have either that team or a skunkworks team who are set out on think about all the black swans, all the existential risk, come back with the most ambitious and the most frightening sets of risks and opportunities you can think of that are informed, right? That you go out and that takes a little bit of research. So, but and I've seen this done now a couple of times, and I think keeping it as a separate exercise, sort of away from the operations, is actually probably, at least initially, is more productive because they're just untethered a little bit more, and so they can think a little bit more uniquely. But that team needs to be empowered to say things that are going to be uncomfortable, right? The teams that are focused on operations and readiness need to also be diverse and also need to reflect different aspects of the business, right? So they need to reflect the people function. They need to reflect the finance function, obviously, the legal function, obviously, but and obviously the business and revenue side of things. But it's not impact on employee base isn't important. Everybody's talking about workforce, but so somebody who represents the workforce from a couple of different perspectives probably ought to be in that conversation. Somebody who represents customers from a couple of different perspectives ought to be in that conversation. So creating the team, kind of the squad that's going to think through this across functions, right, is very important. I think where companies have been successful is they have dedicated budget that doesn't take from anybody else's current operations budget. There's always, you got to find the money for it. So we're not taking away from security to focus on AI. What we're doing is we're creating a digital task force that is instructed to look across the organization and across these domains to better integrate them and to better integrate the advice that they are able to give. And I think was one of the downfalls that we see happening sort of at the board level is that the board will get a series of reports, and they'll get the report from the CISO, they'll get the report from the general counsel, they'll get the report from the chief revenue officer. And they're all going to talk about AI, and they're all going to talk about different risks, and they're all going to talk about different priorities and imperatives. But they're lacking what I call the digital coherence layer. The directors themselves are being asked to do all of that kind of pre-chewing work of like, how do these issues relate to one another? How do these risks offset one another? How do we allocate resources efficiently to address problems without creating new problems? Like that level of analysis is not really happening consistently yet within most organizations. And so from a CEO's perspective, the opportunity to create that team that can digest all these different streams and all these different considerations so that what the board is presented with is a more coherent picture of what the real, conditions are, right? And then they can go about the business of setting priorities and setting budget and allocating scarce resources. Because I think a lot of the frustration we see right now is, this is a CEO function, right? Because this is not the way most organizations are structured today, right? So you need somebody coming in a little bit over the top saying, we're going to do things differently. We're going to be thinking more across function. We're going to be thinking from a variety of perspectives. And that's all going to be attributable to your performance, right? And right. Those rules need to be kind of rewritten a little bit. But if you ask your CISO to do this, without empowering the CISO to go to to go across the organization, you're never going to get a real accurate picture.
Yeah. Plus, domain expertise figures into that as well when you're looking at.
And they have a job to do. They're busy, right? Yeah. They're the other thing, right? So it is a really different way of thinking about. But it's not that you have to reorganize everything. It's that you just need to add a layer of analysis and coherence to all these different sort of considerations. And the workforce stuff comes up in really important ways that are going to be more present tense. I mean, there's a lot of conversation around, are robots going to take our jobs, and what are the tools going to displace, and what is the job of the future? All of that very important, and all of the training that sort of has to sit behind that very important. I think the more imminent problem, though, is going to be you're going to have a workforce that is flooded with disinformation and anxiety around change and disruption in every part of their life. And that those are security risks, those are productivity risks, those are, clarity risks. So how is management today, are you preparing your workforce to withstand the next 18 months of change and dislocation? That's a human question. That's not a technology question, right? And board should be asking that question. Like, what are we doing to support our workforce, right?
Yeah, I think it's hard to imagine a phase of digital transformation that does not have a large people phase in it. So,
right. But that's part of the readiness, right? Which is
yes.
So if you and I right now sitting here today are fairly confident that I can be confident that it's you on the other end of the time where I'm staring at a screen, right? But it's not an avatar of you. It's not somebody spoofing you or pretending to depict you. And that,
as far as you know, but yes.
As far as I know. And this time next year, I will be less confident of that if we don't have a way to authenticate each other coming on, right? But consider that's going on or is going to go on within every organization thousands of times a day, right? And so whether you're talking to a customer or to a boss or to a colleague, we're going to need, and we don't yet have really good ways to authenticate content, even when we think, even the kind of content that we know we should have confidence in it, right? Let alone the kind of novel information we're starting to receive about what these technologies do and don't, and hype and all those other things that we want to sort of right-size. Just even normal conversations are going to be harder to digest in some ways. And so that is going to and is already creating anxiety in the workforce, right? That is already going to slow things down, right? And so managers need to be aware of that. People need to have a strategy for that. It's all those sorts of things that we need to think through that we can safely assume are going to be issues. And I think from a board perspective, what you need to do is ask the question, which is, what are we doing about that? How are we anticipating that? Are we at risk for this? Which departments are most at risk for this? Which people are most at risk of this? Yeah.
How do you see the impact on the law departments of these developments? Both for the new responsibilities and new issues before General Counsel, and then the relationship to
I think the role of the lawyer is changing, right? I mean,
in what ways? Let's talk about that.
I think this, the trusted advisor part of right, and the risk manager lawyer is going to be in ascendance. Mm-hmm. The ability to, as you say, not be the department of no, but the department of how is going to be very important. And they need to have credibility so that when they do say no, or this is too risky, or that's not a ghost in the corner, that's a real problem, right? So issue spotting is going to be very important, but and compliance is going to become very important. But the ability to kind of transform those observations into risk management, I think, is really going to be the key thing. And to be able to articulate that. So that's one role. The other, the more public-facing role of the lawyer is going to be to take all the process and all the standards that we've internally developed, because the regulation isn't going to develop it for us, and be able to express that to your regulator, to your underwriter, to your counterparty in a desired transaction, right? So it's I think lawyers are going to have a huge translation function between and among different departments and areas of expertise, right? So increasing and expanding our vocabularies to accommodate these technologies and their impact is going to be very important for the best lawyers to do.
And then how are agreements going to change for corporate transactions?
I was just thinking about this the other day. I think, I think risk shifting provisions are going to have, adapt for sure. I think for complex long-term agreements, you may end up putting in more ambiguous terms, but then installing more like a construction contract, right? Where you've got somebody on site who's calling balls and strikes as your, as sort of a neutral third party who's kind of arbitrating, decisions that were unknown or unknowable at the time of the contracting. I think those sorts of provisions are going to become kind of a more prevalent solution set for these.
I agree with that, because I'm an outsourcing lawyer, and in traditional outsourcing lawyer, in traditional outsourcing transactions, you're talking about basically transformation. That's why a company is hiring a company to outsource something. I mean, theoretically, if you outsource what you're doing and you're not doing it well, you're just going to lose more money faster. So that's not the point of outsourcing. You transform something before you outsource it.
Yeah.
And to go back to this point directly, if you knew what you were going to transform, it wouldn't be the kind of transaction it is, right? So you don't need the result. So in outsourcing, we create governance models, and then it's going to be, okay, we don't really know who's going to own the IP. So we need a way to figure out how we're going to allocate the IP that right now we don't know what that is. And then in this case, you now add in, uncertainty under the law. How broad is the scope of protectability for generative AI being used to create works of authorship for copyright purposes or inventions for patent purposes? But taking a step back, it seems to me on the corporate side, you need to have a more robust governance structure within the transaction, assuming the transaction is transformative, as its point.
I agree.
And to me, that means you have to have the right people on governance now. And it's a different set of people than have traditionally managed, okay, now we're going to organize our IT function differently. This is a different kind of
This
change.
is a cross-function. That's why I say it really is a CEO top-down function, right? And the board should be asking the CEO to think that way, right? Because you're right, you've got to bring different people to the table. You've got to be prepared to accept not knowing different kinds of things.
Yes.
Right. Like the shelf life of these models is completely unknown, right? I mean, they're the ones that are working very well today for very discrete purposes. No one knows how long they're going to continue to work well, right? I mean, so it's a different kind of a transaction in that sense. It should always be transforming, which is that's a different instrument. If I'm selling you a refrigerator, we know what size and shape it is. We know what its electronics are, and we have history with it. This is not that.
No, when you're selling an enhanced level of customer service or a new digital portal, that's going to depend on how the technology evolves, is adapted, is confusing, is acceptable, both from the customer facing and the internal facing point of view. Right. That to me seems to have a direct impact on both the general counsel and their outside advisors, right? Because it's how do you do this? And then what are the risks that you're going to focus on as you're doing this?
Well, and also, how do you monitor performance, right? Because it is still the case that and it will be for a little while, that the people are the weak link here, right? So you're going to have to supervise people in a way that it's not antithetical, but sort of runs in tension with some of the privacy considerations, right? So now we need governance around what we're monitoring people doing relative to the data and the technology that is secure and different, and that is new and different than the ways we've been doing it traditionally, right? Outside of some very narrow exceptions. And so how do you build that into a risk model? And this is not stuff for the board. Like, the board does not need to be involved at this level. But I think, to your point,
well, let's talk about it anyhow, because it is,
right. The kinds of instruments we're going to need to transact in a world where there's so many unknowns, and they are intended unknowns, right? And they're intended to change.
I agree with that. If you've bought into change, you've bought into known unknowns, and that's the point.
Yeah, and unknown unknowns. I mean, that's we're jointly developing this thing. We don't know what its full capabilities are or are not. So how do we start to talk about scope, right? There's some very interesting issues that people are really working hard on. So it's not like no one's thought of these issues. It's just that I think how you roll that all up into risk, it looks different than I think some of the traditional risk management that leadership is used to doing.
Yeah, I see a big impact in a kind of a way to rethink this now that, data has catapulted itself into a real business asset, in a way that we wouldn't say 2 years ago. It was this kind of asset. It'll drive the deal now.
Among other things, we need an accounting principle that can value data sets. There's all sorts of mechanical stuff that we could be doing now to improve our ability to transact, insure, protect that asset, right?
Okay, so coming from an IP background and dealing with this with a lot of debates as to whether property is, data is a property right.
Right.
And
What do you think?
what do I think? I think you could substitute the right to control for the right of ownership and get yourself through a lot of transactions that way. And if in fact you do have the right to control it and it's backed up through a set of corporate transactions, then I think it works. I think the problem with ownership is uncertainty, and people don't really know what they own because they don't know what kind of asset it is and what ownership means. And therefore, it slows down transactions because of the natural fear. On the one hand, somebody is saying, go commercialize our data. We're sitting on this asset, let's use it. On the other hand, someone is thinking, am I going to give away stuff that I'm going to regret in a year, because I didn't know what I was giving away. And I think at that point, ownership kind of freezes people because they're not sure how to handle or identify, they're not sure how to identify a risk, so therefore they can't handle it. And therefore, this is one of those unknown unknowns, right? What is data and have I done the wrong thing with it? So I kind of look at control then as a way to just establish a right to say I can grant other rights or take other rights because I have sufficient control over this data. I'm drawing under my experience when we do IP transactions. You'll do a deal with a company that'll either own or license or be in the middle of developing certain IP. But that IP is part of the transaction, whether it's owned or licensed in.
Right.
So the way I structure that is, you take that mix that we can control it, at least for purposes of this transaction. And we're comfortable making a certain set of representations and warranties. And if you push me really hard, a certain set of indemnities, qualified as we all do. And I think you can get through building a relationship. And I think it also changes, certain third-party companies are strategic partners. Certain ones are kind of fungible operational ones. Other ones are just kind of foundational ones you can switch in and out, like telecom, right? You don't like your telecom company, you just find a better one. That one's not a hard plug and play one. So I think the risk changes with how you have a topography of your third-party vendors, let's say. Are they true business partners or are they service providers? That's where I think you have to rethink how you do this. And to some extent, if you think it through, it gets simpler. To other extents, if you make the problem bigger, it gets simpler. If you kind of take a bigger horizon, then you get more levers you can play with. And I think more easier to reconcile competing risks of the counterparties,
Yes.
if you're not so narrowly focused. You try and figure out, okay, we have a problem. Why do we have a problem? Let's solve the why first before we go, engineer the very narrow thing where somebody is focused on.
Yeah. Well, and you're circling around an issue that I see come up in a lot of different contexts, which is, and I think this is where AI is going to require us to do more thinking, not less thinking, and which is, happy news for humans, right? But it is working harder to define with more clarity what good looks like. Like, what are we trying to do, right? Separate and apart from what are we trying to defend against? Maybe what we're trying to do is defend against something, but like, what are we're trying to do, monetize our data holdings, right? Or what we're trying to do, figure out our position in a future economy where we hold the keys to some of the information that will be valuable redefining and framing the problem, I think, starts to unlock some of the solutions that you're talking about, right? That where control concepts and partnership concepts and reassessing your ecosystem can make a lot of sense. But the assumptions that we all make about like what good looks like, we just want to get the most money for the data set this quarter, that already sounds hollow as an objective, right?
Yeah, what you've said to me seems to be another spin on what I've just said to you.
Yeah, right.
I've said, make the problem bigger, I think is really a way of saying, what does success look like? Not operational success that we got through the quarter, but also making time to have that conversation, because I think that's part of what, and like when you're saying like, what can boards do? One of the things boards have to do is make time to ask questions that they don't already know the answers to, right? Or they don't think they, where that are genuine inquiries, that are respectful interrogations of like, not the answer you're giving me, but like, how did you get to that answer? Like, show your work,
right?
Yeah.
Kinds of conversations that aren't aggressive, they're just necessary, right? They're just, that is the conversation that everybody should be having is, I can generate 16 versions of a document, but let's have a conversation about why this version is is optimal in this way, right? So the conversations need to shift into that kind of critical thinking gear, but we need to make time for that because that's not how most even deal calendars are set up, right?
Yeah.
And let alone risk management conversations are set up. And so I think that's going to be a really interesting development, and that lawyers can guide in a lot of that. Like we know how to do that and how to run, we know how to run interrogations, but we know how to elicit sort of thinking from our colleagues. And I think that is actually going to be kind of a primary skill, right?
Yeah, I think one of the contributions of lawyers here is to ask some more penetrating questions to kind of pull people back, bringing, both a trusted advisor and just a smart person role in here is like, okay, what is this going to look like 2 years from now? And what have we done to put an impediment into our own 2-year goal? To me, it comes up, a lot in a very simple way. We have a whole contract form book. Let's just use one of those contracts. And I think the lawyer's role is stop a second. Does this form really fit this kind of tech? And does this form fit the problems we have that you and I talked about, which is we can't put a rigid thing in place because what we're dealing with is not rigid. So we have to have a different structure.
Right.
But
you also need management who will tolerate that conversation.
So that's an
and
interesting
make
question.
space for it,
Yeah.
right? And that's what I'm saying in terms of rethinking,
Mhm.
right? And the board could be very useful in setting that tone, right? Which is,
Have you seen that? Have you seen that level of thinking yet?
well, I'll just say green shoots. We're at the green shoots. Yeah.
Okay.
And part of it is that there's still a lot of exigency to the existing agenda, right? There's a lot that sits on top, unless you're going to add a board day or afternoon to explore. It's you see people wanting to spend a little bit more time on these sorts of questions, but not really having the bandwidth in the existing schedules to do it. And so I think that will change over time slowly, but yeah, I mean, early days.
So what do the general counsel do at this point before that time has been carved out to do that thinking at the board level? Because technology is still being adopted. Workforce issues are here.
Yeah.
You're going to have people do something with the tech that you're now embodying in your operations. So,
right. And if we think regulation is going to answer all these questions, like everybody's waiting for the regulations to really tackle these issues. It's like, well, why? Right.
Yeah.
But not because it will be informative for what we have to do, but it's not going to answer these other questions. So what does the general counsel do now is, internally you start to build capacity, right? And it's not going to one of your 3 privacy lawyers and saying you're not the AI lawyer. That's an incomplete solution, right? But it's really sort of trying to reflect and anticipate within the legal department what kinds of resources you're going to need to ask good questions and start to get good guidance. Some of those will be lawyers and some of those will be non-lawyers, right?
Right.
All those things. I think you need as much as you can to start a conversation with the senior leadership, including CEO, risk officer, however that's organized, the CFO, to start to anticipate what alternative information flows would start to look like, right? And then documentation is a whole other issue. But I think the ability to start creating these like AI advisory or digital advisory boards internally, not an external board, maybe an external
Right.
board, but internally, how are you going to start to do the plumbing so that senior leadership has access to the information they really need? Right. I think you can start with the information flows. I think you can start to identify things like data readiness, whether that's not just asking for budget to do more work on getting your data sets ready, but working with the CDO to think ahead about the kinds of resources they will need to do the prep, working with your HR managers to what is the workforce going to need, right? I think the general counsel can start to ask those questions and create a language within an organization
Right.
for those conversations to advance. I mean, I know that's a little abstract, but these conversations are going to take time and somebody needs to start them. And I think the general counsel is in a very good position to do that.
Yeah, I've always thought we're going to see an in-house role like associate general counsel for data affairs, and
Probably should, yeah.
and I think it's probably too narrow to say associate general counsel for AI affairs because AI is too persuasive. You can't narrow it down the way I think you can with data. I think there's a data management function with a legal component that needs to have a lawyer who's on top of it.
And I would say digital more than data.
Okay.
Because I think data is a big piece of it, but I would actually because you've got security.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking
you've got procurement. There's so many.
Oh, the procurement part's going to be really fun. I think all those RFPs are going to change in a funny way that says, tell us how to do something we haven't thought of, or give us a proposal for how to do what we want to do because we don't know what we should be asking you. So I think those RFPs. I will
say that none of the assignments, just to bring it back to like my experience, every assignment we have taken on has involved a truly elaborate scoping exercise.
Okay.
Because it's unclear what an organization wants to do, what it's capable of doing, what fits with the, all very, very contextual, right? Yeah, and you can't do everything. So you got to start, like, how do we start narrowing, to your point?
I always go back to what does success look like?
Yeah, what does good look like? And, there's also a little bit of this it's a little bit like estate planning. Like on the one hand, you have to plan to, like, if I'm hit by a bus tomorrow, and on the other hand, I have to plan for if I live to 150, right? Mm-hmm. Like, both are, like, those are the, but the real question is, what do I have to do today? Like, what am I, but the ability to keep in mind, we are dealing with large existential problems and we are dealing with very practical, how do I start a conversation kind of problems. Like, I think we need to be able to go forward with an expectation that we will be changing altitude all the time. And we need language for signaling to our counterparties when we're switching the question.
Mm-hmm.
So we can, and lawyers can and should have a role in how we do that.
And I think, picking your counterparty is going to be very important because, we've mentioned data security and data privacy, but at some point you're relying on your vendor to be compliant. Because you're tapping into their infrastructure by design, but you're shifting that risk to their success, that they're up to date. So that's a whole nother level of.
But also, but how do your lawyers get comfortable? So I want to now use synthetic data, right?
Okay.
So there is no PII in it because it's not about real people. How do I get my legal team comfortable that the methods we're using to synthesize the data set are sufficient, that now it's like outside of GDPR, right? It just doesn't, it just doesn't, right? The lawyers need to get facile enough with the technologies and with the solution sets. I mean, that's not a solution for all the things, but it's like, what does that activity solve for me or for my business, right? We need to be able to adapt as lawyers and even bring to the table, like, there are solutions to these, like, we'll raise the issue with you using that data set you just found in the corner, but here's like 4 things we could do to move you forward. That's what I mean, the department of how. We need to get good enough and stay good enough to help businesses think through that.
Well, this has been a great session. I've enjoyed talking to you tremendously. And we're going to revisit these issues because I think a lot changes. At the lawyer level, this is not, let's look to the regulations to tell us what to do. That is not going to be the solution. It may be the problem, actually, but it's certainly not going to be the solution. So I think there's going to be a great evolution. It's going to be a fun time. But
it's going to be a fun time. And we're going to have to learn how to grow ourselves and then grow new lawyers. And, like, all of that's going to be happening too, which is really going to be fun.
Well, once again, my thanks. And
thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to AI and Data Law, part of the PLI Evercurrent podcast. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast represent those of the host and individuals being interviewed, and not necessarily those of PLI. For more AI-related content from the Practicing Law Institute, visit pli.edu/AIPod.